back to our course on Excel 2019 Advanced. So far, with everything we've covered on the course, we've been dealing with self-contained workbooks, workbooks that have their own data within them, and even when we've needed to add data from outside, we've imported it into the workbook that we were using. But there are occasions where you want to be able to have access to data from outside, but on an ongoing basis. So rather than import the data into a worksheet, we want to be able to link to it from one or more workbooks. And in some of those instances, we may even be depending on what is, in effect, a real-time update from outside. Now I'm going to cover 3 different scenarios here. In this section, I'm going to look at accessing data from another workbook. Then we're going to look at accessing data from an Access database. And then in the third of these sections, we're going to look at accessing data from the web. Now, as I said, in all 3 of the scenarios, we're going to be looking at situations where the data is held outside of one of our workbooks. And in effect, we're not importing it, we're leaving it outside, but we're going to set up a mechanism whereby our workbook can get that data and potentially be updated in real time with that data from the outside source. Now, in this first example that I'm going to use, I've got some sales data from 2 South American divisions of a company. One division based in Bogota and one based in Lima, Peru. And for each division, I have their sales figures for 2015. Now, Bogota sales are on one sheet and Lima sales are on another sheet. And what I'm going to do is put together a summary sheet, which will combine these 2 sets of figures. At the moment, all of the data is within a single workbook, and we are going to separate this into different workbooks a little bit later in this section. So first of all, let me put in the framework for this summary sheet. Okay, my framework is in place, so what I'm going to do now is copy the figures from the Bogota worksheet and the Lima worksheet. So for the Bogota sheet, I'm going to select the sales, copy them to the clipboard, Control-C, go back to the summary sheet and paste into place, Control-V. I'm then going to go to the Lima sheet and do the same thing. I'm going to copy, Control-C, the Lima sales, back to the summary sheet, but this time instead of paste, I'm going to do a special kind of paste, a paste link. So if I go to Paste Special, you'll see right at the bottom we have a paste link. Now, of course, I see the same numbers, but now if I click on, say, cell D4, I don't get the value 83 in the formula bar. What I see in there is a link, and the form of that link is the name of the worksheet it's referring to, followed by an exclamation point, or a bang as I like to call them. And all the bang does is it separates the worksheet from the cell reference. And then finally we have the cell reference C4. So that's referring to cell C4 on the Lima worksheet. Now I should point out that if a sheet name or a workbook name has a space in it, the name of the worksheet will have quotes around it in order to identify it as a single entity. So what I have there is the standard format of link within a workbook, and when we separate this out into different workbooks later on, you'll see the more complex link that arises. Now, as you may or may not be familiar with the effect of these links, let me quickly demonstrate. And the way I'm going to do this is to go to the View tab, and I'm going to say New Window. I'm just going to increase this up to 160%. Then I'm going to go back to the View tab and select Arrange All. I'm going to select Vertical and OK. Now on the left-hand side, I'm going to go to the Bogota sheet. And again, let's just increase that up. And on the left-hand side, I'm going to go to the Bogota sheet, and I'm going to change where it says 92 to 93. Just watch what happens in C4 on the right. And of course, nothing happens. It doesn't update. But if I go to the Lima worksheet and go to the first cell where it says 83 and change that to 85, Look what happens to the Lima entry on the right. Of course, that has become 85 as well because we have that link in there. So there you've seen how updating one cell on a different sheet in a workbook can update a linked cell on a different worksheet in the same workbook. Now I am going to split these into separate workbooks in a moment, but one or two other things to quickly show you which you may or may not be aware of. Let me just go to the summary sheet on the right and clear out those Lima values. Let me make the same selection on the Lima sheet on the left. And if you hover your cursor over the left edge of the selection, but don't left click, right click instead and drag and drop that selection. And I can drag it across to the worksheet on the right. And when I release the mouse button, I get a little menu, and one of the options is Link Here. So that's a drag and drop way of setting up those links. And one other little trick you may not be familiar with, if I copy the Lima sales figures as before, just using the keyboard shortcut Control-C, go over to the summary sheet and do a Control-V to paste them, you get a little menu down in the bottom right there. And of course you can access your paste link button there as well. So what I'm going to do now is to split this into 3 workbooks. The first workbook will contain the Bogota figures, the second one the Lima figures, and the third one will be a summary workbook, and that's going to use the figures from the other 2 workbooks, but it's going to use them by linkage, not by copy and paste. So let me just do that. Having created those 3 separate workbooks, what I'm going to do is open the Bogota workbook and the summary workbook and paste link the values between the 2. So I have the 2 workbooks open, so let's select the Bogota sales figures, copy to the clipboard, and we're just going to paste link those in. Now notice the reference here from C4 in the right hand window. You can see that I've got the name of the workbook in square brackets, then the name of the worksheet, then the bang or exclamation point, and then the C4 cell reference. So with each of these cells, I have a reference to a cell in a different workbook. If I make a change in the February sales, where I find that this number is maybe wrong, so I'm going to change that to 94, that will also be updated in the summary sheet on the right. Now what I'm going to do now is close the summary workbook. And with the Bogota workbook still open, I'm going to make another change. So I'm going to say that my March figure is also wrong, and I'm going to change it from 94 to 91. Notice I am doing this when the summary workbook is closed, and now I'm going to close this workbook. Now what happens next is very important. What I'm going to do is open the summary workbook without the Bogota workbook already open. Now the first noticeable thing there is that you get a security warning. The reason you get a security warning is that as far as Excel 2019 is concerned, you're opening a dangerous workbook because it's a workbook that has a link to the outside world. You're probably fairly familiar with the dangers of opening workbooks that have programming code in them, but opening a workbook that has links to the outside world can be a dangerous exercise as well. The good news is that in this case, you know it's not dangerous, and the other good news is that once you've trusted this document, you won't get this warning again. So we're going to trust this document by saying Enable Content. So what I'm going to do now is to close this workbook yet again and reopen it yet again. Now this time, instead of the security warning, we get the regular warning. This workbook contains links to one or more external sources that could be unsafe. If you trust the links, update them to get the latest data. Otherwise, you can keep working with the data you have. So now you get a choice of updating, or you can say don't update. So we're going to update. And if you saw there, the March figure changed from 94 to 91 now that we've updated that link. However, this does raise another issue. Perhaps the whole point of this summary workbook is to produce a management report, and you want to be able to send this workbook to various people, but they won't have the individual workbooks, the Bogota workbook or the Lima workbook. You just want them to see the summary figures basically at a point in time. But what you can do is set up this summary workbook so that it doesn't prompt for those updates. So on the Data tab, in the Queries and Connections group, you have an Edit Links button. Notice the links are listed, and the link we've got here is to the Bogota workbook. There's a small button in the bottom left-hand corner called Startup Prompt, and there we have 3 options. So what action do we want to take when this workbook is opened? The 3 options that we have are let users choose to display the alert or not, don't display the alert and don't update automatic links, and don't display the alert and update links. So if you don't want the alert and you want the updates to happen anyway, you could choose that 3rd option and you won't get the alert, it will just happen. The option we want though is the middle one, don't display the alert and don't update automatic links. And click OK. Now I'm going to save this version, and of course if I open this version I won't get those alerts and I won't get a security warning. If you have any doubts about that, then I suggest you use the files in the course files folder, perhaps put in the Lima link as well, and try going through those security steps I've just described to you to make sure that everything works the way that I said it would. So that's about it on connecting to other workbooks, except for 2 important points. One of them is, if you look at this particular link in the formula bar, it's a very long link, most of which is taken up with the folder name. You can edit and type in link names. You don't have to establish links in the way that we've said. Note in this particular case, those single quotes though. Because there are spaces in those folder names, it needs those quotes in order to be able to identify it as a single entity. And the other important point is that links, when created automatically, usually contain folder names, a reference to a particular location of a workbook. And if you move workbooks around, that can really mess things up. So if you're going to use linked workbooks, it's important to either, for example, keep all of them in one folder and remove the folder names, just have the workbook names in those links so that if you move everything around together, they are still in the same workbook and therefore don't need the folder names to keep the source workbooks. So those are a couple of things that you need to be aware of. That's about it for connecting to other workbooks. Join me in the next section where we're